They said war would make heroes. They didn't say it would smell like blood, rot, and wet earth. Before we begin, subscribe, not for glory, but to remember what it costs. Because what happened on that field in northern France in 1415 was not victory. It was survival. The ground was already broken before the first arrow flew. Rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the valley of Agincourt into a lake of mud and misery. English men-at-arms stood knee-deep in filth, their armour soaked, their bellies empty, their nerves stretched thin as bowstrings. Across the valley, the French banners shimmered with pride. Hundreds of knights in polished steel, horses stamping, priests chanting. They were certain they would crush the starving invaders before the sun set. William Archer, a young longbowman from Essex, wiped the mud from his eyes. He was 22, too thin, too tired, and too afraid to admit it. His bow was warped from the rain, the string frayed, but his hands didn't shake. He looked around, faces pale with exhaustion, men clutching crude stakes hammered into the ground to stop the French charge. No one spoke. The silence before dawn was heavier than the armour itself. Then came the drums. The French sounded them like thunder rolling through the mist. Behind their lines banners waved, lilies of gold on blue, a sea of nobility about to drown the enemy in arrogance. William's stomach tightened. He thought of home, of a small church and a field that didn't stink of death, but the voice that cut through his thoughts wasn't God's, it was the King's. Henry V rode down the muddy line, mud splattering his silver armour, voice steady as stone. "You stand not for gold, but for England," he said, "for your brothers, for your lives. Let the French see what hunger can do." A murmur rose, weak at first, then stronger. William drew an arrow from his quiver. It felt heavier than before. The first horn blared. French cavalry began their charge, hooves churning the swamp into chaos. The sound grew like a storm, thousands of tons of flesh and iron thundering toward the English line. William's bow creaked, his fingers burned, the rain stung his eyes. Now! A black cloud rose into the grey sky, tens of thousands of arrows. They fell with the sound of tearing fabric and breaking flesh. The first wave of knights stumbled, horses screamed, men fell and vanished into the mud. Still they charged again. William loosed another arrow, and another. His world shrank to the rhythm of breath and draw, the dull thud of impact, the screams of dying men. One horse crashed yards away, spraying mud and blood across his face. He didn't flinch. He couldn't. When the arrows ran out, the real killing began. The French crashed into the stakes, splintered wood, crushed ribs, mangled steel. The English line trembled. William dropped his bow, grabbed a broken sword from the ground, and swung as the first armoured body fell into him. The mud swallowed everything. Blades, prayers, humanity. Minutes stretched into eternities. When the horns stopped, there was no cheer, no triumph, only the sound of rain and the whisper of dying men. William looked down at his hands, trembling, filthy, blood-stained. He had survived, that was all. He didn't yet know that the worst was still to come. Before the mud and the screams, there was only hunger. 3 weeks before Agincourt, the English army was already dying on its feet. The march from Harfleur had broken them. The siege had drained every ounce of strength. The dysentery had taken more men than the sword ever would. By the time they reached the Somme, they were ghosts in armour, trudging through rain and sickness toward a country that hated them. William Archer walked barefoot. His boots had rotted days ago. The skin on his feet was cracked and bleeding, wrapped in scraps of linen he tore from a dead man's tunic. The smell of infection hung thick in the air. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The bread was gone, the meat spoiled. The only thing that filled their bellies was water and prayer. At night, the camp was silent, except for coughing and the low murmur of psalms. Men prayed not for victory, but for a painless death. The fires were small, the light weak. Every flicker cast long, ghost-like shadows on the faces of soldiers who no longer looked like soldiers at all. Henry V walked among them in the dark. No crown, no gold, just a cloak soaked in the same mud as theirs. He spoke quietly, not as a king, but as a man who knew what fear was. "They are many," he said, his voice carried by the wind, "but they are proud. Pride breaks before hunger does." The men listened. They didn't cheer, but something small, almost invisible, flickered in their eyes. Belief. William sat by the dying fire, his bow beside him, his stomach twisted in pain. Across from him, an older man with one eye was staring into the flames. "They'll kill us all," he muttered. "You know that boy?" William didn't answer. The man spat into the dirt. "Ain't about England anymore. It's about not dying like a dog." He turned away and lay down in silence. The next morning, the fog was so thick it felt like the world had disappeared. They marched north, step after step, through fields of black mud and broken farms. Villagers fled at the sight of them, clutching children and bread. The English didn't steal, not out of mercy, but because they had no strength left to lift their weapons. By noon, they saw them. The French vanguard, banners flashing through the mist, knights in polished armor that gleamed even under grey skies. It looked less like an army and more like a parade, trumpets, plumes, horses. William had never seen anything so bright, so alive, so terrifying. He wanted to turn back. Every man did. But the king stood before them again. No heralds, no ceremony. Just a man, soaked to the bone, sword in hand.
"This day is not about numbers," Henry said. "It is about will. They have gold, you have purpose, and I will tell you this, God fights not with those who shine, but with those who endure." A murmur rose, quiet, grim, like the wind before a storm. William gripped his bow tighter. The men around him, thin and trembling, looked at one another and nodded. Some crossed themselves, others just whispered to the sky. That night, they slept in a field that would soon become legend. The rain returned, steady and cold, washing over faces that didn't yet know they would never see another sunrise. William dreamed of fire, of horses, of the sound of arrows. He awoke with the taste of iron in his mouth and the smell of fear in the air. At dawn, the horns began to sound from the French side. The hungry army rose, picked up their bows and faced the storm. At dawn, the mist rose like smoke from a battlefield that had not yet begun. To the French, it was a morning for triumph. Inside their golden camp, men laughed, servants poured wine, and the sound of armor being buckled was almost ceremonial. They were not preparing for war, they were preparing for a hunt. Sir Guillaume de Longueville adjusted his breastplate, polished to a mirror's gleam. He was 37, a knight of old blood and new scars, wearing the fleur-de-lis on his chest like a promise from God. Outside his tent, his squire was struggling with the reins of a restless stallion, a massive black charger bred for the charge, not the chase. Guillaume ran a gloved hand across the horse's neck, whispering, "Aujourd'hui, mon ami, today we ride to cleanse the mud of England from France." The camp buzzed with the noise of confidence. Trumpeters tested their horns, priests blessed the ranks, and nobles boasted of ransom gold they would soon claim from captured English lords. They laughed at the reports of the enemy, Fewer than 10,000 starving half-dead, led by a boy king with a broken army.
"They will fall before breakfast," one lord declared, raising a goblet. The others cheered, toasting not to God, but to glory. Guillaume didn't join in. He looked toward the horizon, where the English banners shivered in the cold rain. He'd seen battle before, and he knew pride was the sharpest sword and the quickest to break. Still, he could not show doubt. His family's crest was painted on his shield, his lineage written in the folds of his cloak. To falter now would be to betray centuries of nobility. A herald entered, bowing deeply. "Messire, the constable requests your company at the vanguard. The king's cousins lead the charge." Guillaume nodded. "Of course they do," he muttered. He took his helmet, engraved with silver vines, and fastened it under his chin. Outside, the army shimmered in impossible splendor. Rows upon rows of knights in plate armor stood like statues of divine arrogance. Their banners rippled through the grey mist, blue, red, and gold, colors so bright they seemed to mock the sky. Behind them, the footmen and archers, peasants, conscripts, farmers, waited in silence, uninvited to the feast of pride. Guillaume rode to the front ranks. There, the dukes of Alençon and Brabant were laughing, their armor gilded, their horses pawing the earth. "Have you seen them?" Brabant grinned. "A rabble of scarecrows. By noon, they'll be begging for mercy." Guillaume forced a smile. He wanted to say mercy doesn't come from numbers, but he swallowed the thought. Across the valley, the English line stood motionless, a dark, muddy wall behind a row of sharpened stakes. No music, no banners, no beauty. Just men, filthy, hollow-eyed, silent. The rain fell harder. A priest lifted a silver cross and shouted, "Deus vult, God wills it." The ranks repeated it, louder, a roar of iron and thunder. Guillaume joined in, his voice caught between faith and fear. He raised his sword, its edge glinting in the pale morning light. "Forward!" The horses surged.
Mud exploded beneath their hooves. The valley shook with the sound of 10,000 tons of steel colliding with the earth. The knights of France charged, the flower of chivalry, the pride of the kingdom, riding straight into the jaws of fate. Guillaume lowered his lance, eyes locked on the enemy's line. The first arrows hadn't yet fallen. For a fleeting moment he believed the glory was his. And then the sky darkened, not from clouds, but from a storm of English arrows. He never heard the first man scream. The sound came first, a hiss like the tearing of the sky. Then came the shadows, thousands of them. Arrows rained from the heavens, blackening the dawn. They fell with the weight of God's judgment, slicing through armor, flesh, and pride alike. William Archer loosed his first shaft before he even realized it. His bow bent under the strain, his fingertips raw and bleeding. He didn't see faces, only targets, dark shapes thrashing in the mist. Each release was a rhythm. Draw, breathe, release. And above it all, the screaming of horses, high, wild, human. Across the valley, Guillaume de Longueville felt the first arrow slam into his shoulder plate. It didn't pierce, but the impact nearly broke his balance. Another struck his horse's flank. The animal reared, eyes rolling white, foam flying from its mouth. Guillaume gritted his teeth, spurred it forward. The mud rose like waves around its hooves. "Keep formation!" he shouted, though the air had already turned to chaos. The French charge, so precise and glorious minutes earlier, was now a frenzy. Horses stumbled over fallen men. Armored knights sank waist-deep into the mud, helpless beneath the weight of their own splendor. The valley that should have been their killing ground had become their grave. William watched as one knight, gilded, majestic, vanished into the muck, swallowed whole. Another wave of arrows whistled overhead. William's arm shook with exhaustion, but he forced himself to nock another arrow. "Keep firing!" cried his captain. "God's with us!" But William wasn't sure. No god would drown men like that. On the French side, Guillaume's vision blurred. His lance had snapped. His horse was bleeding, screaming. He could see nothing but rain, mud, and flashes of movement. An arrow struck his thigh, deep, hot, like fire spreading under steel. He fell. The world spun sideways. For a moment he lay still, the weight of his armor pinning him to the ground. He tried to rise, but the mud clung to him like a living thing. Then came the second charge, the French reinforcements pushing forward into the slaughter. They trampled their own wounded, blinded by honor and madness. The English line held. Stakes, shattered bones, arrows turned the air into death. William drew one last shaft, took aim at a mounted knight bearing a crimson crest. He released. The arrow flew, silent and straight, and vanished into the storm. When the sky finally cleared, it wasn't blue. It was grey and heavy like smoke after a burning field. The valley was unrecognizable, a sea of bodies, armor, horses, and blood mixing into the mud. Men groaned, crawled, begged for mercy. Others were silent, faces half buried in the earth. William lowered his bow. His fingers wouldn't uncurl. He could still hear the arrows even though they had stopped. He could still smell the iron, the sweat, the fear. He wiped his mouth with a trembling hand and tasted salt. Tears or blood, he couldn't tell. Somewhere among the fallen, Guillaume de Longueville opened his eyes. The rain dripped from his visor. The world was muffled, like he was already underground. Through the haze he saw movement. Figures in tattered leather, stepping carefully between corpses. English soldiers. He reached for his sword, but his arm refused to move. He closed his eyes again and whispered, "Mon Dieu, pardonne-moi." The battle wasn't over. The killing hadn't even begun. The rain had stopped, but the air still stank of blood and iron.
The mud that had swallowed horses was now filled with men, gasping, groaning, dying. It was not a battlefield anymore. It was a slaughterhouse. William Archer stood among the wreckage, his bow snapped, his hands trembling. The English banners fluttered weakly above him, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Men walked through the valley in silence, finishing what the arrows had begun. Some searched for friends, others stripped corpses for coin. Every few steps William saw a hand reach out from the mud, fingers clawing for help that would never come. The French had fallen by the thousands. Knights, the sons of dukes, counts, noble blood, lay trampled beneath the boots of peasants. The pride of France was unrecognizable, buried under its own weight. William stepped over a body, his breath shallow, his mind hollow. He had survived the arrows, but now he faced something worse, the aftermath. A horn sounded. Through the haze of smoke and rain came King Henry himself, his armor streaked with filth, his eyes dark and distant. He dismounted slowly, surveying the carnage. Behind him, his captains whispered, "Too many French prisoners, too many enemies still breathing." If they regrouped, the English, so few and so weak, would be destroyed. Henry's voice cut through the murmurs. "Kill the prisoners." Silence. Then disbelief. Even the wind seemed to stop. William turned to his captain, thinking he'd misheard. But no. The order came again, colder this time. "Every man with a blade. Do your duty. Leave none alive." The king's words fell like another rain, but this one of dread. William froze. Before him knelt 3 French knights, their armor cracked, faces pale. One looked barely older than him. He was praying. The other met William's eyes and whispered, in broken English, "We yield." William's grip tightened on the sword he'd taken from the mud. His mind screamed, no, his body didn't move. Around him, the English began to obey. The sound was unbearable. Not battle, but murder. Steel through flesh. Please cut short. The valley filled again with noise, this time without glory. William raised his sword. The boy before him closed his eyes, whispering, Sainte Marie. William hesitated. His hand shook. Then, a captain's shout behind him, Do it, Archer, for the king! He swung. The sound was dull, heavy. The boy's body fell forward into the mud. William stood frozen, the sword still raised, his throat burning. He wanted to vomit, to scream, to pray. But nothing came out. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning anymore. When it was over, the field was silent again. No songs, no cheers, only crows. William dropped the sword and fell to his knees. The mud swallowed his hands, but he didn't care. He looked around, at the blood, the bodies, the broken banners, and felt no victory. Only the weight of something that could never be washed away. Far behind the English lines, among the piles of the dead, Guillaume de Lanville still breathed. His body was crushed, his legs shattered, but his heart refused to stop. He saw the sky turning dark and wondered if it was night, or if heaven had already closed its eyes. He thought of his family crest, his wife, the son he'd never see again. Then, faintly, he heard the English singing, a victory hymn, low and trembling. He smiled, not from joy, but from the bitter truth of it. So this is God's will, he whispered, and let the rain wash the blood from his face. Morning came, but it brought no light. The fog clung to the earth like a shroud, and the crows had already begun their work. Where yesterday there had been banners, there was now only silence. A silence too heavy to belong to peace. William Archer woke to the sound of boots and flies. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep, if he'd slept at all. His hands were stiff, his eyes swollen, his armor crusted with dried blood that wasn't his. Around him, men moved like ghosts, collecting swords, finishing off the wounded. Victory, they called it. But it looked more like penance. King Henry walked through the field with his helmet off. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He murmured a prayer, half to God, half to himself. Every few steps he stopped to look at the dead, French and English alike, as if trying to tell one from the other. He couldn't. No one could. The ground squelched under William's feet as he moved. He saw faces, open, broken, unrecognizable, each one a story cut short. He thought of the young knight he had killed the day before, the whisper of Sainte Marie still echoing in his head. He wondered if God had heard it, if God had heard any of them. At the edge of the field, a Frenchman stirred. William knelt beside him, the man's armor dented, his breathing shallow. When he removed the helmet, mud poured out first, then a face, pale, sharp, streaked with blood. Guillaume de Lanville. The eyes fluttered open. For a moment, neither spoke. Two men, enemies by accident, survivors by chance. William reached for his water skin and lifted it to Guillaume's lips. The French knight drank weakly, his gaze fixed on the grey sky above. Then he said, in a voice barely more than a breath, "You fight well, Englishman. Too well." William swallowed hard. "I didn't want this." Guillaume's cracked lips curved into something like a smile. "No one ever does." The knight coughed, a red froth spilling from his mouth. He looked at the horizon, where the crows danced over the dead. "Tell me," he whispered, "did we win?" William hesitated, then answered truthfully, "No." Nobody did. Guillaume nodded faintly, eyes dimming, the last of his breath leaving with a quiet sigh. William closed his eyes, pressing the man's gauntleted hand into the mud, as if returning him to the earth that had already claimed so many. By noon, the valley of Agincourt was still. Smoke from burnt armor rose in thin spirals. The English gathered their dead in silence, their victory as bitter as the rain. Henry ordered mass, but no one sang. Even the priests seemed afraid to speak God's name in that place. As the army prepared to march, William looked back one last time. The field stretched endlessly, a graveyard without markers, a monument to nothing. He thought of home, of fields that grew wheat instead of corpses. He wondered if anyone would remember the faces, or if they'd only remember the numbers. He picked up his bow, cracked and useless, and slung it over his shoulder. Someone behind him shouted, "God is with us!" William didn't turn. He only muttered under his breath, maybe he was, or maybe he just watched. Then he walked away, the mud swallowing his footsteps. The last sound left in the valley of the dead.